Hello children, and welcome to today's collective worship. I'm going to start, as I always do, and you know what Mrs. Robinson has to do, by sharing my screen. And I'm going to start by saying, this is the day that the Lord has made. And together we can say, let us rejoice and be glad in it. So, today, children, we're going to be thinking about something a little bit different. It's a story from the Bible, but to help us understand it a little bit better, I want us to think about something else. Sometimes we think that bad characters always stay bad. But I wonder whether they can actually change. So sometimes we think when we read a story, we expect that the bad person always stays bad. But what I want everybody to think about is, can people change for the better? When we look at the pictures that we're looking at now, when we think about the big bad wolf in Little Red Riding Hood and the three little pigs, I wonder whether we'd feel differently if we saw a newspaper article saying big bad wolf jailed for eating grandma and destroying the little pig's home. We might read that and think, oh my goodness, that's awful. What a terrible big bad wolf. How could he possibly do that? And sometimes we just expect people to be like that, or characters in books and stories that we've read. Back in the old days, when these stories were originally created, the big bad wolf would actually go to prison for his crimes because he wasn't a nice wolf. But we do know that actually, by the end of his time in prison, he did actually become a changed wolf. While he was locked up, he had time to think about what he'd done. And actually, because he was such a mean wolf, he reflected. And the first thing he planned to do when he was actually set free was to go and see the little pigs and say sorry. And do you know, although the little pigs were understandably quite nervous about seeing him again, they weren't sure if he really had changed. But he tried to prove it to them by building them each a new house. They weren't quite sure what to make of it. And then he dashed over to Little Red Riding Hood and he apologised to her and said, I wasn't a nice wolf. I haven't been a nice person. And again, he apologised. And then we have to think, well, what if the big bad wolf really had changed? And this time there was a different newspaper headline. And it said, big friendly wolf makes amends. Now, for those of you that don't understand what that means, it means he's actually saying sorry. Sometimes we have to think, can people actually change? And when we read things in the newspaper, do we actually believe it? I wonder. So I've got a story from the Bible to share with you. And sometimes the stories in the Bible can be a little bit difficult to understand, but hopefully by hearing all about the big bad wolf, you may try to think, I wonder if there's any similarities. Let's find out. So this is the story about Peter, Barnabas, and Saul. Peter was very excited As the leader of the follower of Jesus, or Christians as they became known, it was his job to meet all the new converts who had become Christians and get to know them. And then he had to give them jobs to do. Helping with the poor and the homeless people, healing sick, or telling others all about Jesus. He was excited this particular morning because a friend of his had told him he had special news of a new follower who wanted to spread the news about Jesus. Peter was sitting in his office sipping on his coffee when his friend knocked and entered. "Ah, Barnabas, good morning. I hear you have some good news. Tell me, who is this new follower of Jesus that you'd like me to meet?" Barnabas couldn't stop smiling. He said, "It's Saul of Tarsus." At this news, Peter's eyes widened and he accidentally spilt some of his coffee. But before it had time to fly across the room, Barnabas said, "Let me explain what has happened." So they talked, and Peter and Barnabas talked about the fact that Saul didn't like Christians. In fact, if there was one man that Christians feared more than anyone else, it was Saul. He had made his mission very difficult for Christians. He was not a nice man and he hurt people. He had them arrested just because they believed in Jesus. So you can probably understand why Peter was very, very surprised when he heard this news from Barnabas. And he was also surprised that Barnabas wanted to spread this news about Saul. Barnabas said, "It's okay, Peter. He's changed. Believe me. You have to believe me." And even though they were talking about what Saul had done, they started to think, "I wonder if he has really, really changed. Could it be true that somebody has changed so much from being such a bad person to now believing in Christians, in Jesus, and spreading the news about Jesus? Could they really trust somebody like Saul?" But Peter started to think, actually, people can change, however bad. And when Saul came to see him, he welcomed him with open arms. It turned out that Saul had actually become one of the most important people in the church. He supported Jesus in everything he did. And Peter and Barnabas were very pleased to welcome and see all the changes that Saul had made. Now, as we look at the candle, this is where Mrs. Robertson asks you just to think about what we've been talking about today. And this gives us an opportunity just to have a quiet moment to think, I wonder if you know anybody who's been a bit mean to you, who maybe has said something. Maybe they've changed. Maybe they thought you didn't believe them. But the most important thing is, could you forgive them? Because sometimes people do things that aren't very nice and they do regret it. But people can also change for the better. And sometimes we need to help people to change. So remember, if you do ever have a friend or somebody that you think hasn't done something nice, remember to give them a chance. Remember to listen and think, actually, they could have changed. We're going to share a prayer together now, and I'd like you to put your hands together or close your eyes, and I'm going to say this special prayer. Dear God, thank you that whatever we have done, you always manage to see the good in us. Help us to follow your example, that when people around us change for the good, we can change our negative attitudes into positive ones. Help us to always remember this. Amen. Okay. Thank you for listening today, children. And remember that important message that we've talked about. And remember to always think and see the good in others. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you all soon. Bye for now, children. Bye-bye.